Well, Beharrell, thank you for joining us on the Conciliators Guild podcast. It's a real pleasure to see you again. Will, you are the founder of Fathom Trust, and I'm sure during this podcast we're going to hear a lot about what you're doing at Fathom Trust and its purpose, etc. But just in terms of introduction, you are also, I believe, a member of the NHS and a psychiatrist in training. But maybe most importantly for what we're doing today, you are also worked in Afghanistan and a founding member of Turquoise Mountain, which is an international NGO that has worked on heritage and socioeconomic development across the world. And we're looking forward to hear about all of that. So you've spent lots of time in Afghanistan, and the reason we're speaking to you today is because the American withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 long years is a moment, I think, for reflection, to hear from people who've been on the ground over there what it was like, what they learned, and what they think the consequences are of where the country's come to, really. But Will, let's start with Afghanistan. Tell us what took you there and what you did there, really. Let's start with on the ground in Afghanistan.
What took me there? As crazy as it sounds, I found a book on train, and for people like me who are inspired by reading, that took me in this very exciting direction towards Afghanistan from the age of 17. It was Danziger's travels, actually. Nick Danziger had a Churchill scholarship and travelled through Afghanistan and a number of other countries along one of the Silk routes many years ago, in the 80s, I think. And the chapter on Afghanistan really grabbed me in a way that the other chapters didn't. They were fascinating, but something about this country and the way he described it wanted me to know more. So I read more and studied Arabic and Persian at university, and was really, I think, trying to get closer and closer. I had a bit of time in Pakistan, got to the border in Peshawar, had a summer in Tajikistan, again got to the border, and then finally had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan in my early 20s with Rory Stewart, who very graciously allowed me to do a bit of research with him, and then to go out with him to start this charity. So it was very much a project that Rory was undertaking on behalf of both the president at that time, Hamid Karzai, but also the Prince of Wales. And this came on the back of a visit to London during the Afghan Compact, when the international community pledged, I think, £21.2 billion for nation building in Afghanistan. But in amongst that, all of that, and during that trip, Hamid Karzai visited the Prince's School of Traditional Arts and was really inspired. And they had a conversation during which he said something like, "I'd love to do something like this in my country." And that really, I think, was the seed of what came to pass. So really, over the last sort of 15 years or so.
So what did you do there exactly in that time once you got there?
The vision was always to establish something like the Prince's School for Traditional Arts, an institute for Afghan arts and architecture. In fact, we did do that, but it ended up being much, much more than that. It ended up being this holistic, integrated urban regeneration project with various projects spinning out of that throughout the country. At the heart of it was a sort of 7.2 hectare piece of land in Kabul's city centre, just on the edge of District 1, where all the main ministries were, on the riverfront, called Murad Khani. And this was home to about 165 families. It had been on the front line of multiple episodes of various civil wars in recent history. And yet, despite all of that, there were the remnants of these magnificent, mostly sort of mid-19th century courtyard houses with cedar shuttered screens with these ornately carved floral arabesques, going back to the Mughal period. And this is where we started. So one of these on the riverfront was an old merchant's house with 44 rooms. This was falling down at an alarming rate, being used to store goats and bananas, mostly, as I can remember. Around it, all these other houses were falling down as well, being burnt for firewood in some cases. There were smouldering piles of refuse around every street corner. It was the place in that part of the city where drug addicts would come and make their home on the streets. There was open defecation. The health of that part of the city was was suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a lot of respiratory disorders. So that was the flavour of it. But to make it sort of particular for a minute, this was a Shia enclave at one time in a largely Sunni city, and it was built defensively. And there were these tunnels that would connect a series of streets throughout that quarter. I remember crawling through one of these tunnels because the street level had increased by about 1.5 meters with layer upon layer of rubbish really over the last few decades. So we were leopard crawling through this tunnel to get into the square that emerged on the other side of it. So we just started digging that out, and I think there was this moment early on in the project where we had a senior Pashtun engineer. He stood on a roundabout with a megaphone and basically announced that any able-bodied male of working age who wanted a job should be here at 5 o'clock the next morning. It was that kind of story, and we equipped them with pickaxes and wheelbarrows, and we started by clearing rubbish. That was how we started, and then very rapidly after that, we had a visit of a delegation from the municipality ordering us to stop. See, Murad Khani was on the riverfront, and it was slated for destruction according to a communist master plan. And various iterations of this master plan had found their way to the then mayor, who wanted to build a 6-lane highway, which involved putting down what to him were these worthless remnants really of a previous civilization. So, but the community stood in their way, and they said, actually, no, this is our community, and the municipality backed off. And there was a fundamental lesson in what life was like in Afghanistan. The so-called sort of the reach of those political, legal, rational institutions didn't really even stretch half a mile from the mayor's office into Murad Khani. So we started working out actually where was the authority, where was the legitimacy, how do we run a project like this? Much more to say, but that was how we started.
Well, it's fantastic, Will, and very evocative. The imagery is fantastic, and we're talking to other people about Afghanistan, etc., and I already see a common theme, which is this, let me call it almost like abstracted political planning from a distance versus the on the ground, very granular work where the local culture is very much more appreciated, etc. So you help these people rebuild their community. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes. There was a combination of emergency repairs to stop houses falling down. Much of the workforce for that was drawn from the local community, but by no means exclusively. We brought in experts, sort of master craftspeople where we could find them. And part of the community also formed the backbone of our clinic workforce and our primary school. And actually, we did have students in our institute from the community too. So yes, I don't want to give the impression that this was a sort of an easy process or something that was entirely unified. There were pockets within that community who were motivated by very different things, and it was part of our job to work out how to help people in as broad and effective way as possible. But what was absolutely true was that we were on the ground every day for 5 years and beyond with that community. And, we had people intercepting us on the street to tell us about a door that needed replacing, or about a relationship that had gone wrong and could we help, or about someone who needed a kidney transplant and could we help. So, it got to the point, and this is no exaggeration, where it's a very playful community. And, as a sort of fresh-faced early 20s Englishman on those streets, I would regularly be the butt of many jokes, I'm sure, some of which I understood, many of which I didn't. And many of these were coming from local women who would kind of gather around in their burqas, and we would just have a back and forth. And I would rehearse my pretty awful diary, and they would tease me for it. But I generally got to know them by their voices and their gait, and so it was an intimate project, and unusual for that, I think, in the context of nation building.
And do you consider it a success, what you achieved there? And do you know what's happened to that community now, by the way?
I do consider it a success. Of course, it depends how you measure that. I mean, if you measure it in terms of relationships, yes. Those relationships have endured many challenges, and they've endured the course of time. Architecturally, I think it's been a terrific success. It's won various UNESCO awards and World Monuments Fund awards. I think the school and clinic have educated an entire generation now of young children and exposed them to the best of their own civilization, which I hope will have sown the seeds of amazing things to come. And it's proven itself commercially successful. We've recouped at least $12 million now back into that economy through the sale of their crafts. So yes, I think it is, but it's also, at this time when we're speaking in the context of American withdrawal and Taliban resurgence and Islamic State, highly vulnerable, of course it is. And our staff and our friends with whom we've spent the last decade or so, though they weren't technically working, or they weren't working for the British government or American government, nonetheless, the association, I'm sure, will be made. And we're obviously highly aware of that.
Will, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard from you before that what you also found was that some people who were taxi drivers or chefs, let's say, in fact had other lives where they were craftspeople, craftsmen, craftswomen, and that you helped them reconnect to that. Is that right? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
That is absolutely right. I mean, that was particularly the case as we were starting. I mean, talking about the market or the audience or the appreciation for art in a kind of post-conflict societies wouldn't be the sort of first thing you'd think of. So I think it was sort of seen, slightly raised a few eyebrows, but they had become used to a certain sort of Soviet Eastern European style of art, and had moved quite a long way from some of the genuinely world-leading traditions and motifs of, let's say, the Mughal period, just as one example. So we, in casting the net around and by word of mouth, found a greengrocer, a taxi driver, a secretary, and they were between them, well, at least they claimed to be, and in some cases were, world-leading craftspeople, ustads, a master craftspeople we called them. So within a few weeks, we had a head of a woodworking school, head of our calligraphy school, and a head of our ceramics school. And in time, we added jewelry and gem cutting. And I suppose that was hugely important for two reasons. One, they came with a sense of legitimacy and authority, and with a memory of having done this, 20, 30 years ago. But that created the space then for young people to be formed in their wake. And that was, I think, of equal excitement, was when the young students suddenly emerged as young ustads in their own right, and there was a whole future represented in their hands. I mean, that was amazing.
Well, and of course, it also means that they were creating beauty, whether it was through wood or metal or gems, which is not exactly something we should all sneer at in our daily life. To have beautiful things around us is something we all seek. And so they were actively doing that and then teaching future generations how to do so, even amidst a very difficult circumstance.
It's you put it so adroitly. I mean, it's exactly how it was. I mean, there's this sense that beauty can be the preserve of a cultural elite, or that cultural heritage is something that you take an interest in when all your other needs are met, in a sort of Maslowian way. I think it's absolutely not that. I think it's so much more than that. And I love that quote from the third Earl of Shaftesbury, which is, "Trust in that which beautifies, and life will become beautiful to you." And here we were in the midst of, a really quite sort of testing conditions for everybody, and beauty became something, it's a universal language, something that we can all learn to see, which I suppose is the first challenge. And in beauty is belonging and dignity, and belonging and dignity are things that we struggle with in the West, I think, hugely, and probably have quite a lot to learn from our friends in Afghanistan.
Yes, indeed. And also, when you produce something beautiful, you also have a sense of achievement, which is also a fantastic feeling that you've done something. There it is in front of you. It looks good. You've achieved something. And the other thing I've read about, I don't know very, very well, but I have read about this, is that there is some work out there that shows that working with your hands is very psychologically healthy. It somehow uses both or all parts of the mind in a very good fashion, and gives people a sense of achievement, a sense of being able to work in fine detail, yet see the larger forms of things. So that's the other aspect of it that I think is also very useful at the individual level.
Well, I can't help but make the link back to your earlier point about the abstract nature of sort of central planning. I think one has to ask, well, firstly about the sort of the effectiveness and legitimacy of a central plan, but also about who's making these plans and where are they making them. And I think the notion of working with your hands seems such a sort of vivid challenge to that. That on the one hand, that it's your work. There's no mistaking that. You have to take responsibility for it. You learn by making mistakes, and those mistakes are visible to others. There's a sense in which you start off by thinking that you're going to shape this material into something that the image of which you start with in your own mind. But then actually in the process of making, the material itself shapes you, and often what you end up with is not what you started with in your mind, but something that's actually much better and takes on a life of its own. And you do so in the company of others often.
Now your last comment, I think is probably core to what you and I are discussing today, because even in my own work as a diplomat, whether I did it from a capital or locally, there was always the question of how much was I in context. Now, the example you're giving us from Afghanistan is, in a sense, the other end of the spectrum. You are completely in context. You were like immersed in the physical and emotional and cultural reality of a certain district of Kabul. That's quite in context. But I think there's a spectrum, and it's something that diplomats and policymakers, they're aware of, but maybe not enough, which is how close are any decisions that are being made, any plans being made, to the context. And it's, of course, the further physically distant you are, once you're making plans from a global capital, the easier it is to be completely decontextualized. Example, the American invasion of Iraq is probably the best example of a completely decontextualized plan that once it hit Iraq and once any kind of sense of nation building began, it no longer worked because it was not at all fitting with the context. So this notion of working in context is crucial, and frankly, one of the main reasons we wanted to speak with you. You've done it. We encourage it. I just wonder whether these lessons can be taken more deeply into centralized decision making in politics. I don't know.
I suppose, yeah. Is it Blake who says, "As a man is, so he sees"? And I think starting with yourself has to be crucial, because clearly, what you choose to see and what you're capable of seeing are determined hugely by how open you are to self-knowledge. And I don't want to sort of dive into psychoanalysis or anything, but I think as a practical point, it's one that we can all take on board. I mean, just to sort of broaden it for a second, I was talking to someone who trains horses recently, and if you imagine a person and a horse whose minds may be mutually exclusive, certainly it's impossible for us to understand what it feels like to be a horse on a Tuesday morning like this. But nonetheless, those two creatures can come together in that way and bond, and then move forward together. And much of it's done physically. So it's to do with synchronizing heartbeats. It's to do with synchronizing the range to which your iris contracts. It's to do with posture and walking alongside rather than squaring up. And the horse begins to trust the person and vice versa. And I think the context of in your world with the Conciliators Guild and the mediation work, which is not my world, but the challenge of speaking to people whose culture you don't share, and who will be asking you, what are you here for? What do you see? I think to start with an awareness of your own limits, and your own biases, I suppose, is actually incredibly helpful.
I couldn't agree with you more, and it's something I've often said to myself and to anybody I can come near, which is when you're dealing with any foreign culture, the first thing you should know is the limits of your knowledge. Let me tell you something quite interesting relates to all this, that I've had a similar conversation as with you with a former American Green Beret who was on the ground doing what Green Berets do, which is fundamentally special forces, but community linked. And he said the one lesson out of Afghanistan is that the United States, writ whole, went there without any knowledge of the local circumstance, which is the exact opposite of what you did. Or, well, you went without knowledge, but you made an effort to gain it. And it is this juncture between abstract plans and the actual reality. I don't think it's easy to bridge it, to be honest. But I think that's where massive amounts of constructive work will take place in diplomacy and politics and development, is to make sure that the abstract plans aren't the master of the local circumstance.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think clearly abstract plans carry with them knowledge which has the potential to change lives and give people dignity and belonging and all those things. But the plan itself, needs to be highly flexible and adaptive. And I suppose if there's a bridge between that and a sort of small-scale contextualized approach, it is to do with imagination. And I suppose there's something to do there with a higher calling, I think. In the same way that music is rendered material by being written up in manuscripts and notes, which represent the music and carry it and allow it to be reproduced, but aren't in themselves the music. I think there's a lovely analogy there with us, I think, as human beings, as participating and carrying with us a sort of participation in something that's higher. And I think in that there's a sort of purpose and meaning that goes obviously well beyond facts and plans, and is something that maybe is generative across cultural boundaries.
Well, and it also reminds me of the work of a gentleman that we are both quite familiar with, and that's Ian McGilchrist's work and his book, The Master and His Emissary. And to put it incredibly succinctly, that we don't understand how our right and left hemispheres of the brain work. And we also don't understand that, generally speaking, the right hemisphere can see more broadly, more in context, and the left hemisphere is much more focused and targeted and grasping. And therefore, the right, because it sees much more broadly and is inclusive of the left, in a way should be the master. And that doesn't mean that they have to work together. It's what you've just said about the abstract and the local. The ability to make them work properly together is something we haven't mastered at all, actually, and probably the work ahead.
I mean, there is something there, isn't there, about the sort of diversity of influences and a hierarchy. Sometimes a hierarchy can be very helpful. And I suppose in Afghanistan, it was common to be in a room of people who sort of may not have met before, but within minutes, the room was working as a group of people. So the hierarchy there, whether it was to do with age or tribe or allegiances, occupation in some cases, was worked out, the pecking order, in other words, was worked out very quickly. And that enabled people to relax. And there was, therefore, most meetings started and finished with humor and laughter and jokes, often at someone's expense, but nonetheless jokes. And that was really interesting for me. Poetry, song, dance, these aspects of their living kind of cultural traditions were part and parcel of everyday life, and were important. People would, they were substantial and meaningful. They weren't just there for flavor or entertainment. And again, a real lesson to us in how to communicate. I just to give you a very brief story. I had to very unfortunately shut down a project in a town in Afghanistan where we had a wonderful project, but it just wasn't really going to be very sustainable. So I arrived a great deal of anxiety, wondering, how I was going to do this. Essentially, laying a lot of people off work. I was thinking about compensation and conflict and fairness, and I sort of I delivered. I was not going to muck around, and I delivered what I needed to say. The imam, there were two imams in the room. One of the imams, and it was a sign that they were taking this seriously. Everyone was at the meeting, and he told a joke, and it was a really rude joke. Not about me, but just about. Well, I won't repeat it. It was just too rude. But everyone laughed, and the whole room burst out laughing. So I said, "Okay, well, I've got a joke," and I told a joke. I mean, they basically said, "Well, we were wondering when you were going to come and say this. We were surprised it wasn't a few months."
Well, you're way ahead of me. I can't remember a joke for the life of me. And then, of course, if you can't remember it, you can't tell it. So you're way ahead of me on that. But Will, you've taken these wonderful experiences that you've had, and you've kind of depicted to us a little bit, and you've brought them home to the UK, and you've created something called Fathom Trust, something with quite an interesting name, actually. Tell us a bit more about that, the organization you founded, and what its purpose is.
Thanks, John. Fathom is the old English word to reach out and embrace, and it comes from a time when people used to measure the girth of a tree with their arm span before we had an empirical measure. And I love it because it's to do with a sense of depth and inquiry and a physical connection to the natural world. And in a sense, it's not purporting to do anything new, but it's trying to reimagine and recreate what we used to do more of, which was relating to the earth with our hands and making things, and either sort of functional things or beautiful things. It could be either. And in that sense, it's an effort to integrate what I saw in Afghanistan, but also what I've seen as a doctor in the NHS and as a trainee psychiatrist, which is the limit really of the biomedical model, and the real limit of often prescription medication to tackle the root cause of a health problem. Not to say that prescription medication isn't life-saving and transformative in many situations, but there's some things I think we just need to acknowledge about contemporary Western life. And in Britain, one of them is that the model we have for the NHS isn't working. In my part of the world, in Wales, it's predicted to consume 67% of national revenue by the end of the decade. I think it's a little bit like the universe. It just continues to grow, and services continue to get bigger, and demand continues to grow, and as life expectancy grows, and so on and so forth, and technology creates new forms of being treated. Many lessons, I think, to apply from Afghanistan to that, but one of the sort of central lessons with Fathom is the potential in a therapeutic relationship between master and apprentice for healing, where the output is a form of cultural expression based on a raw material. And in this case, we're working with a network of landowners across my bit of Wales and the Brecon Beacons, where we're working to awaken hearts to beauty. This is a sort of soulful approach to health and healing based on crafts, conservation, and contemplation. Those three things really run through everything that we do. So we work with three groups. We work with youngsters, knowing that the majority of illness starts in childhood often. Also knowing that youngsters really struggle now to access active connections to the land and the ability to make things and relate to animals and fauna and flora. So we have an enriched curricula, which we call fingertip philosophy, which helps youngsters to discover the world for themselves with their fingertips. And this is about health literacy. So it's about posture and movement and understanding how the mind works. But it's also about natural philosophy, asking questions: what is our relationship with nature, and what does it mean to be alive? And then it's about making. So teaching youngsters how to make a woven willow lunchbox with an antimicrobial beeswax food wrap, for example, or a three-legged stool. This is what we're hoping to do this year. The second group are people who have been through the health system with a chronic mental physical illness, now at the other end, and still feel as if they're in need and their needs aren't satisfied. And to that mind, people who are queuing up for that, who are on a waiting list but haven't yet accessed that system. And could the Fathom approach be a way of helping them come to terms with, move through, experience healing from that particular illness? And then in the third group is the workforce. So knowing that workplace stress is the sort of number one driver of depression and anxiety in the UK. Knowing that the workplace is a sort of life-crushing experience for many, and particularly NHS workers at the moment for obvious reasons. So using this methodology for them to help them rest and regenerate and refocus, but hoping to generate a revenue from that to drive the sort of outreach in the communities. And one of these are the heads of the valleys communities that are sort of post-manufacturing, post-industrial, objectively quite deprived, judged against index of multiple deprivation, and working with youngsters who aren't in school to see if we might be able to establish some of these life-giving connections for them through making.
So in a kind of frenetic and stressed out world that's too technological, you're taking people back to nature and back to basics in a way. And actually, in a way, you're taking them back to what you experienced in the Afghan community, where you learned all this in some degree.
That's, I mean, exactly. And it should be simple, you know, this, and it should be something that we discover ourselves. It needn't have a grand plan. I mean, and there are lots of calls for there to be a sort of rigorous empirical kind of grounding to this before people take it seriously. But, you know, a friend of mine said it's a bit like inviting a group of NHS colleagues for a picnic in the woods, and they'll say, well, I'll come, but only if you can tell me what type of rug we're going to be sitting on, how far away from the trees we are, what the trees are going to be. Some of this is self-evident, I think.
Right. Well, Will, maybe one last question to you. Now that we've heard a bit about Fathom Trust, and very much good luck with that enterprise. Let me take you back to Afghanistan and maybe zoom out a bit.
Yeah.
How do you feel about where the country's come to as a whole, not just the local communities? It is a bit of an abstraction what I'm asking you, but you know, the Americans are leaving. I think that has all sorts of security implications for the country, as we're seeing. Do you have a sense as to the future of Afghanistan? Do you want to have such a sense? What do you foresee for that country? And maybe even more importantly, what is the biggest lesson you would tell a policymaker about what happened over the last 20 years?
I suppose to start with the personal reflection, it's inevitably an uncomfortable question because it feels wrong in a sense, doesn't it, to be rehearsing the sort of abstract academic lessons from an endeavour that's had such a human cost and continues to do so, and knowing that colleagues and friends in Afghanistan at the moment will be feeling that threat in a very bodily, imminent way, which we just can't relate to here. But nonetheless, that thinking does need to take place if we're to avoid mistakes that we've made, or improve, or work out how to be involved in that way in a more beneficial way in the future. So I think it's a good question. Someone once, I think I read once that if you, depending on how you see time, either as a line or as a circle, will shape how you reflect on experiences. And I think for us, in the West, we obviously see time as a line. Predominantly, it's the sense of progress. Afghanistan, I think, though I don't know, I suspect it's much more of a circle, that they've been here in this situation in living memory or in the memory of their immediate ancestors several times over. And I think that there's something interesting in that about humility and the recognizing the limits. And once you recognize limits, then you can begin to achieve things. And that then I think makes it much more about depth than it does about scale. And you stop wondering how big can this be, and you start thinking how deep could this be. And I think there's probably a lesson in that for us. I think there's also a lesson here about relating to time, about generations. So at Turquoise Mountain, we had daily contact over many years with youngsters who were born and in our early years groups, all the way up to the elders whose funerals we attended, or their fatiha, to which we were invited. And knowing now that we were there in 2006, we're still there now. We hope to continue to be there throughout. That generational difference gives you real hope that if we could just hold on to a very basic set of conditions where people can continue to learn, work, relate, then the youngsters then you represent a real hope for the future, and a break with some of the sort of negative habits of their immediate ancestors. That tells me that actually maintaining a sort of light footprint over the long term, though it would come at short-term cost, might actually be quite a prudent thing to do. And I think also, if you take away even a light footprint and you witness the scale of collapse that's beginning to happen. I mean, if you look at the I think the report that came out this week on the Afghan Analysts Network about the number of civilians killed even by IEDs, it's in May and June, the numbers are up as high as they were in 2014 to 2018. So that makes it sound pretty bleak, and I think it is. But I think there's real hope in the experiences that we've had particularly with our young people, and they just need some space to grow, I think.
That's great, Will. And I like very much the differentiation you made between depth and scale. I think attending to depth requires a bit more patience, i.e. a bit more time, than a rapid sweep of scale. And that's the amount of time and how we attend to things politically is something of great interest of mine, because I really don't think we have it right. And the digital technology isn't helping us to get it right either. So that's, I think, an excellent note to leave it on. Thank you for that note of hope. Thank you, Will, for this very fascinating discussion, and the best of luck with Fathom Trust, that we'll be watching with eagerness to see how it evolves and how it helps people as well. Thanks a lot, Will.
John, thank you for the opportunity to recall some of this, and a very best wishes to the Conciliators Guild as well. It sounds like a really, really valuable and much needed enterprise.